Welcome back to the Ergo Proxy Theme Retrospective. For this episode, we're going to be focusing on something which I feel a lot of post-apocalyptic anime, or shows in general, try to comment on, and that is the idea of the behavioral sink and stagnation, and ultimately, nihilism. Now, Ergo Proxy is a commentary on many things, and among the many things it comments on are the idea of the behavioral sink and nihilism. The show does this by tying the two together, and then ultimately refuting nihilism. But first, what are these concepts that the show discusses? Now, the behavioral sink and nihilism are concepts with a great amount of nuance to them, but can also be boiled down to relatively simple cores. The behavioral sink is a term coined by John B. Calhoun, and it's a controversial phenomenon accredited to overcrowding and abundant resources other than space. In these conditions, purposely created and simulated for mice by Calhoun, individuals seem to exhibit a variety of negative behaviors, ranging from increased and unwarranted aggression to complete social withdrawal up until the point where the population essentially stagnates and then collapses in on itself, even though there's still an objectively abundant amount of other resources, such as food and water. Now, this phenomenon was observed in mice by Calhoun, so it's controversial if such things truly occur in humans, but it is noted that people do need certain amounts of space and time dedicated to themselves to maintain mental health and maintains healthy social interactions, and that the increased anxiety and decreased space in some urban settings can be detrimental to one's mental health. Nihilism, on the other hand, is a school of philosophy that, while quite diverse, usually manifests itself in its dismissal and/or skepticism of anything having any intrinsic value, and the concept that most things and undertakings are essentially pointless. In the show, these two concepts are tied together by the interactions and nature of the dome cities, and the nature of the proxy project itself. The domes serve as manifestations of the behavioral sink, and their seemingly abundant resources and consumerist ethos overcoat a stagnating and decaying society, which, for the most part, seems either quite apathetic or artificial. And we can see this further with certain behavioral manifestations carried out by the city's leadership. In the case of the regent and the governing council, and Daedalus to some extent, these behavioral oddities seem to manifest in a sort of withdrawal. The regent and governing bodies are never seen outside of the throne room, and while Daedalus does leave his offices from time to time, he doesn't really seem to have too many human interactions. Even on a professional scope, he seems to prefer either isolation or the company of autorevs. Now, the one exception to this, of course, is his creepy obsession with Riel, although this could also be argued to be some kind of behavioral abnormality, a deviant behavior brought upon by his environment. As for aggression, we can see this in the case of Raul, who, while being upset for justified reasons, is completely consumed by rage, and even after affirming his will to live, goes on to lose his sanity on his crazy revenge quest. The declining mental health of the city, brought upon by the sink and objectively bad environment outside, then combine to form a sort of nihilist miasma, which hovers over the dome and within the dome. Knowing that the outside is toxic and that the proxy plan was a backup to the humans waiting in space anyways, the city government kind of devalues everything it does in the domes, and the domes themselves. As a result, human life itself is devalued, and people are born to serve the dome, even though in the beginning it was planned to be the exact opposite. As such, those in charge of the dome lose all drive and initiative, and instead of trying to make progress themselves, are content to simply stew about and await something out of their control to happen. Just think, if Romdau is this technological and consumerist marvel it seems to be, wouldn't the people inside have the resources to put together some kind of colonization or cleanup scheme? Couldn't they develop filters to scrub the air? Or a vaccine to make people immune to its toxins? Or set up a series of smaller colony domes? Couldn't they objectively do something other than await death? And the answer is probably, at least from an objective point of view, yes. Though it is here that we must consider the subjective point of view. As mentioned earlier, the city sees no point in this, as it is convinced of its nihilistic views, and thus condemns itself to squander its resources and ultimately die. Instead, the behavioral deviations brought upon by the behavioral sink are allowed to continue because the government has either given up hope or can't be bothered to hope. Even arguing that this lack of initiative was born out of respect to wait for Vincent's return, wouldn't the benevolent creator of Romdau want his people to succeed? Would he really be opposed to any attempts at cautious growth? Would he really instead want this malformation of a society to continue on its current path? Now, quick tangent, when I say malformation of a society, I mean to say that the society of Romdau itself also seems to be some kind of hellish creation of the behavioral sink. While it is clear that some in the higher classes still seem to enjoy some kind of humanity or human interaction, the society itself seems very unhealthy. There is a very strong push for blind consumerism. Human interaction seems to be within an all-time low, with these maybe possible exceptions of the professional sphere. People are consumed by their so-called assigned purposes, and while it is clear that some in the higher class are doing okay, those in the lower case are probably not doing okay. It is a very stratified society glorifying ignorance, or at least pushing for ignorance, where everyone is literally assigned a role at birth, and where actual questioning of the human condition is censored and drowned out by a consumerist tsunami. Individuality is highly discouraged, and those on the bottom must abandon themselves if they wish to ascend to anything slightly higher. We can see this especially in the immigrant districts, where a quote model citizen is basically someone who doesn't question anything or think anything of their government other than vague positive. Even in the higher levels of government, the behavioral sinks effects cannot be outran, as not only do they contribute to the stagnant mindset mentioned earlier, but also a hell of bureaucracy and shuffling the deck chairs. Objectively, many of the interdepartmental squabbles and beefs we see throughout the series are not really too important. While Rawl and Daedalus, for example, have different mindsets and departments, they are theoretically on the same team, and shouldn't beef as much as they really do. Instead, they should try to work together. In the nihilistic world of the sink, however, there really is no point or drive to anything, so objectivity becomes lost and the two feud with each other over no real reason. Again, while there is window dressing of a reason here, Rawl wants to stop Riel so he can get to Vincent first, and Daedalus wants to help Riel because he's unstable and creepy, this isn't objectively enough if we think about it. None of these people really care about their orders from the top, so couldn't they construct some kind of mutually beneficial conspiracy? Well, I think they definitely could. They cannot, however, as in a world where nothing really matters, people struggle to come together for any kind of greater goal. Again, I don't necessarily think that this is weak writing, but an active commentary on how stagnation of a society via a behavioral sink ultimately drives people apart. They are driven so far apart, in fact, that they obsess over meaningless formalities. And this is what I mean when I say shuffling the deck chairs. This phrase references the pointless nature of moving chairs on a sinking ship, and is well applied here. Is the red tape in Romdau really needed? Did the Regent really have to censor literally everything related to the truth or the proxy? Did Daedalus really need to try and blackmail Rawl? Did Rawl really need to try and push Daedalus and Riel completely out of the picture? The answer to all these is realistically no, but the nihilism of the Dome has fostered a world in which, for to those who did do it, it was very important, because they struggled to reconcile their desire for meaning with the denial of any meaning by the system present. And this leads us to how the show goes on to refute nihilism, and ultimately affirm the beauty of life itself. While it may seem very dark, Ergo Proxy in fact goes much out of its way to refute nihilism, and is actually a much brighter show than it initially seems, and it does this by discussing the ideas of rebirth. Although Ergo Proxy's story is seemingly very dark, it's actually a tale of rebirth, and the undefeatable nature of life itself. This is seen in both the development of the main cast and the world of Ergo Proxy itself. When the series starts, the Earth of Ergo Proxy is blatantly stated and implied to be a dead world. It is simply dismissed as such. Its dust and air are toxic after all, and the world outside the Dome is really seen as nothing. Life in the Dome isn't much better, as we've already discussed though, and this seeming paradise of organization is really a stagnating paradise of boredom. And this is where the story begins, in a world seemingly both dead inside and outside of the Dome. As the series progresses though, we see that this isn't true. Inside of the domes, the main cast start to show that humanity isn't completely dead. Characters like Riel, Vincent, Pinot, and even Rawl show that humanity isn't done yet, and might even bounce back. They and their development show that life is still going on and finds a way, and that soon they will start to manifest their humanity and lives in even more lively ways. In a literal sense, the quest of Riel and Vincent takes them to many strange lands, and these places show that humanity is not all alone on this world either. The commune sees some bugs about, and fish in the water. The forest shows plants still go on and even thrive in some areas. People can and do adapt to the air, and some even live in the wastes, which, while they are wastes, are not completely inhospitable or dead. Life is slowly going on and seemingly bouncing back. The Earth itself is undergoing a rebirth. It is in this world where we see our main cast grow even more, proving that they are humans and still alive, and that life still has a chance. In fact, they grow to embrace life and affirm it, proving life will continue even in the seemingly dead wastes. However, while life outside the domes seems to be slowly coming back, life in the dome deteriorates. It turns out that denying the meaning and beauty of life is not conducive to it. This accumulates when Romdau itself collapses and the dome is destroyed, by a proxy who sees life as pointless and ultimately wants to destroy humanity. While some might see the collapse of Romdau as symbolic as the final collapse of humanity, it seems more simply to mean the age of the Dome is dead, and that nihilism itself has failed in this regard. And this means that the era of stagnating death, the era of the dome, is slowly coming down and in fact being replaced, and in fact being subsumed by an era of slow rebirth. This is confirmed when humanity descends from the colony ships along an orbit to recolonize their ancestral home and harken a new age of life. As such, Ergo Proxy proclaims that life is beautiful, and that nihilism is something that we should not embrace, as it will only destroy life, which is a beautiful thing. It also says that life will go on to overcome these challenges presented by nihilism, and that by overcoming nihilism and the behavioral sinks of the world, humanity can still live on, no matter what the circumstances. As such, Ergo Proxy refutes nihilism itself and affirms the beauty of life, and the point of life.